fire all 27 employees my mother-in-law planted inside my father's company. I said it standing in the middle of the executive lobby at Ashcombe Precision Fabrication, the manila envelope still in my hand, the decree inside it barely a day old, the judge's signature so fresh, I swear I could still smell the ink. Early morning light was coming low and slanted through the tall front windows, catching the dust in the air the way it always did before the floor really got moving, and somewhere down the hallway a coffee maker was still gurgling through its cycle, ordinary and oblivious to everything I was about to do. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press the envelope flat against my ribs just to keep from dropping it, and I said the sentence twice, quietly, to make sure it had actually come out of my mouth and not just my head. I was standing exactly where my father used to stand every morning at 7, in the doorway between the lobby and the production floor, wearing the navy blazer with the brass buttons he'd given me the day he named me vice president, the one I always wore when I needed to feel like the woman I was supposed to be instead of the one I'd spent 8 years pretending to be. Behind me, through the glass, I could see the floor where it had all started 36 years earlier, machines already humming to life for the morning shift. Nobody in that lobby knew yet what was about to happen. I did, and for the first time in a very long time, that was exactly the way I wanted it. My father, Walter Ashcombe, built Ashcombe Precision Fabrication out of a single rented machine shop on the industrial edge of Dayton, Ohio, in 1988, with 3 second-hand lathes and a loan he didn't tell his own mother about because he was afraid she'd tell him not to take it. He used to tell me that in the first winter, the roof leaked so badly over the second lathe that he kept a bucket bungee corded to the ceiling joist and simply worked around the sound of it dripping, because he couldn't afford to shut the shop down for repairs and couldn't afford to lose the one contract keeping the lights on. By the time I was old enough to understand what the company actually was, it had grown into one of the largest precision metal fabricators supplying the regional aerospace and automotive supply chain, employing over 400 people across 2 facilities in Dayton and a satellite plant an hour north in Sydney. I grew up on that floor. I knew the smell of cutting oil before I knew the smell of my own perfume, knew the particular ringing sound the CNC machines made when a batch finished clean, knew which of the old-timers kept butterscotch candy in his coveralls pocket for the Saturday mornings I trailed my father through inventory counts. On my 30th birthday, my father called me into his office, slid a folder across the desk, and told me that 25% of the company was now legally mine. "This is yours because you earned it," he said, "not because you were born into it." I have never forgotten the way he said it, like it was a fact and not a gift. For years before that, I had married Julian Pemberton, a kind, easygoing man who worked in logistics consulting and who, for the first 2 years of our marriage, made me believe that his family's warmth was simply generosity. His mother, Cordelia Pemberton, was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday down to the year, who sent handwritten notes on cream cardstock, who never once raised her voice in 8 years of what I now understand were forced pleasantries. She hosted Sunday dinners with the kind of practiced ease that made you forget you were being managed, candles lit at exactly 6, a new casserole dish every time, always asking after my father's health with what sounded like real tenderness. She never asked for anything directly. She asked for things the way water asks a crack in a foundation to widen, patiently, and only when no one was looking closely enough to notice the shape of what she wanted. "Family should look out for family," she told me once, over a dinner she'd cooked herself, when she mentioned that her nephew Desmond had just finished a business degree and was between things. A few months later, Desmond Pemberton was our new procurement coordinator, and I remember thinking it was generous of my father to make room for him. "He's so sharp, it would be a shame not to use him," Cordelia said of him again, months after that, when a second cousin needed placing in logistics, and I remember nodding along, because it sounded reasonable, because everything she ever said sounded reasonable for exactly as long as it took me to stop listening closely. The first thread came loose 18 months into my time running operations alongside my father, on a rainy Tuesday when I was reconciling a batch of invoices at my kitchen table with the lamp on because the afternoon had gone gray early. A shipment of structural bolts, $41,000 worth, showed up on the books twice, once from our longtime supplier, and once again, 3 weeks later, from a company I didn't recognize, for the exact same order. I mentioned it to Julian first, almost as an aside over dinner, expecting him to shrug it off as a clerical error the way I half expected to myself. He laughed, fork still in his hand, and told me I was seeing conspiracies where there was only family helping family, that I'd been reading too much into spreadsheets again. I let it go. 6 months after that, a much larger thread came loose. Our aluminum stock contract, a $2.3 million annual agreement that had been competitively bid for a decade, had been quietly reassigned to a supplier called Hargrove Metal Supply, with a signature authorization dated the same week Desmond had been promoted into procurement leadership. Hargrove had been Cordelia's maiden name. When I raised it with Julian a second time, sitting across from him at that same kitchen table, he didn't laugh. He went cold, told me I sounded ungrateful for everything his family had done to welcome me into it, and didn't speak to me for 2 full days, moving around our house like a man sharing space with a stranger. I never raised it with him again. Something in me went quiet instead, and I started paying attention in a different way. The way you pay attention to a house after you've heard something move inside it at night, listening without ever turning on the light. I began keeping my own records after that, a private notebook I kept locked in a desk drawer at the office my father didn't share, filling it in the evenings after Julian had gone to bed. The house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Eventually, I hired a forensic accountant named Miriam Sokol, paid entirely in cash, meetings twice a week at a diner 40 minutes outside Dayton, in a town small enough that nobody from either family would ever think to look for me there. Miriam was methodical in a way I found almost soothing, unwilling to say a single word until she had documentation behind it, always sliding folders across the sticky diner table face down, the way people pass things they don't want a waitress glancing at. It took her 11 months to fully untangle what had been built inside my father's company, and every time she handed me a new folder, the picture got larger and colder. The third rung of the ladder was the one that made my stomach drop the way falling does. Large equipment orders, some worth over $500,000 apiece, moving through the approval chain on a single signature. Desmond's signature, alone, bypassing 3 separate layers of review that had existed since before I was born. Nobody had questioned it because Desmond had by then been quietly promoted twice, each promotion arranged over a family dinner I hadn't been invited to, each one framed to my father as simply rewarding a hard-working young man. The fourth rung was the one that finally showed me the whole shape of it. Miriam found a shell company called Pemberton Logistics Group, registered 18 months earlier, billing my father's company nearly $94,000 a month for warehouse and distribution services. I asked her where the warehouse was. She sent me an address, and on a gray Tuesday afternoon, telling Julian I had a dentist appointment, I drove there myself, alone, and found a self-storage facility off Route 9 with a hand-lettered plywood sign zip-tied to the chain-link fence that simply read Pemberton Logistics. Inside Unit 114, when the manager let me look, there was nothing but a folding table, a space heater, and a stack of unused shipping pallets leaning against the wall like a stage set nobody had bothered to finish building. My father's company had paid over $1 million in 11 months for infrastructure that did not exist. By the time Miriam's final report was complete, bound and tabbed in a black 3-ring binder I still keep in that same desk drawer, the total sat at just over $4 million over 6 years, siphoned out through inflated invoices, phantom consulting fees, a shell company billing for phantom warehouse space, forged secondary approvals on equipment purchases, and shipments quietly rerouted through Desmond's signature to vendors owned, directly or indirectly, by 27 people connected, to Cordelia Pemberton through blood or marriage. There were nights during those 11 months when I sat in my car in our own driveway for 10 or 15 minutes before going inside, just to arrange my face into something ordinary, something that wouldn't give away what I now knew and Julian didn't. I got good at ordinary. I got good at asking about his mother's garden and meaning nothing by it, at sitting through Sunday dinners with a smile that never once slipped, at watching Cordelia refill my water glass with the same warm, careful hands that had helped bleed $4 million out of a company she had married into by proxy. I did not confront anyone during that stretch. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the confrontation to come first, and it didn't. I filed for divorce that spring, citing irreconcilable differences, and I told no one why, not even my father, and I sealed Miriam's full report in the bottom drawer of my desk and waited. Julian seemed almost relieved which told me everything I needed to know about how far apart we had already drifted. My father called me every evening during those months, ostensibly just to read me the day's production numbers, his voice sounding a little lighter each time, and I let him believe that was really why I was picking up the phone. Some people would call what I did during those months cowardly. I call it patient. The decree came through on a Thursday morning in March, and I read the judge's signature twice before I let myself believe it was real, sitting alone in my car in the courthouse parking lot with the engine still off, morning light coming flat and gray through the windshield. I drove straight to the office, the envelope still in my hand, wearing the navy blazer, and I stood in the lobby doorway where my father used to stand every morning at 7, and I said the sentence I had been rehearsing quietly to myself for 11 months. Within 20 minutes, our head of HR had a full list cross-referenced against Miriam's report, 27 names, every one of them connected to Cordelia Pemberton through blood or marriage. Within 2 hours, the terminations had begun. Department by department, security escorting people out through the side entrance before most of the floor even understood what was happening, boxes of desk photos and coffee mugs carried out into a parking lot still slick from morning rain. Within 4 hours, Desmond Pemberton's badge had been deactivated and his office cleared into 2 bankers' boxes by a security guard who wouldn't meet his eyes. Within 6 hours, Preston Vale, the logistics manager who had married into the family 2 Christmases earlier, had already emailed his resignation from the parking lot before anyone even reached his desk. My father, when I finally handed him the full black binder that afternoon, read it standing up at his own desk, in total silence, for 11 minutes, his reading glasses pushed up into his gray hair, his jaw tightening once and then going still. Then he looked at me and said only, "Send me the report to legal." That was all. That was enough. Cordelia arrived at my house that night, uninvited, headlights sweeping across my living room curtains a little after 9, and she pounded on my front door hard enough that my neighbor's porch light flicked on across the street, a dog barking somewhere down the block in response. She was yelling before I even had the door fully open, a rage I had genuinely never seen from her in 8 years of forced pleasantries. A woman who had built an entire persona out of never once raising her voice, now nearly unrecognizable with it. Her hair coming loose from its usual careful pin, her hands cutting through the air as she talked about everything she and her family had done for this company, for my father, for me. I let her finish, standing in my own doorway with the porch light throwing both our shadows long across the walkway. Then, astonishingly, in under 30 seconds, her voice dropped into something soft and pleading, an entirely different register, invoking family and love, and how none of this had to be permanent. How this could all still be undone quietly if I would just make one phone call to legal, just give it a little time, just let it go the way family lets things go. I almost admired the audacity of it, the sheer speed of the turn, fury to tenderness in less time than it takes to boil water. When that didn't move me either, her face changed one more time, jaw setting, and out came the threats. Her lawyer, her connections, people who owed her husband favors going back 20 years. This isn't over. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Her face changed then, just slightly, a flicker of something under the fury, and I knew in that moment she finally understood I wasn't bluffing, that there was no version of this where quiet, patient Diana blinked first. I answered each phase of it in short, flat, factual sentences, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, steadier than hers had been in 8 years. The report has already gone to legal, I told her. There's nothing left to undo. Then I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I closed it quietly, the same way I had closed every door in this for 11 months, and I stood in my own front hallway for a long moment afterward, listening to her car finally pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Rebuilding was work, not magic, and I want to be honest about that too. We spent 4 months restructuring procurement from the ground up, sitting in a windowless conference room with Thaddeus Cray, a steady, sharp-eyed operations manager my father brought in from a competitor, mapping out a new vetting process on a whiteboard that stayed covered in half-erased flowcharts for most of that spring. We rebuilt the vendor list from scratch, reinstated the 3-layer approval process that had quietly been dismantled one signature at a time, and put controls in place that would have caught Desmond's very first invoice inside a week instead of 6 years. Thaddeus insisted on cross-checking every new vendor against a registry of business filings, a small, tedious habit that would have unraveled Hargrove Metal Supply on day one had it existed back then, and it became, quietly, the backbone of everything we rebuilt. Within 2 quarters, vendor costs had dropped by nearly 21%, simply from returning to competitively bid contracts instead of the inflated invoices Hargrove Metal Supply and its sister companies had been submitting for years. By the end of that fiscal year, Ashcombe Precision Fabrication posted the strongest quarterly earnings in the company's 36-year history, and our on-time delivery rate, which had quietly slipped for years without anyone quite understanding why, climbed back above 98% for the first time in nearly a decade. Numbers, not adjectives, were what finally made the rest of the company understand what had actually happened and what it had actually cost us. Cordelia's lawyer, we later learned through channels of our own attorney, reviewed the full forensic report during the early stages of a civil suit she threatened to bring against the company for wrongful termination, and quietly advised her that pursuing it any further into discovery would very likely trigger a criminal referral for fraud, that the 27 names and the $4 million and the empty storage unit off Route 9 would not survive a single subpoena. The suit was withdrawn within 6 weeks, without a single word of explanation, a one-line filing that closed the matter as though it had never existed. Desmond left the state entirely by that summer, last seen, according to a cousin who still spoke to my father, somewhere outside Charlotte. Preston Vale, the logistics manager who had rerouted shipments on Desmond's signature for nearly 2 years, resigned by email at 11 at night and moved to Arizona before his final paycheck had even cleared the bank. One by one, over the following months, the rest of the 27 simply stopped appearing at family gatherings my father still occasionally heard about secondhand, drifting out of the Pemberton orbit entirely. Pemberton Logistics Group was dissolved that fall, its registration quietly withdrawn with the state, presumably to bury whatever paper trail still remained. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was hauled into a courtroom in handcuffs. They simply scattered, quietly, the way people do when the only thing that had ever protected them was someone else's silence, and I had finally, completely, stopped being silent. My father, when I once asked him over dinner whether he regretted not pressing criminal charges against any of them, set his fork down and thought about it for a long moment before he answered, the way he thought about most things that actually mattered to him. He said only that watching them lose everything they'd built on stolen ground was punishment enough for him, that people like Cordelia had spent their whole lives needing to be seen as respectable, and that losing that, quietly and completely, would outlast any 6 months a courtroom could have given us. I understood what he meant, and mostly I agreed with him. But I'll admit, because this is a confession and not a fairy tale, that some part of me wanted more, wanted to watch it happen in a room with a judge in it, wanted the word fraud said out loud where everyone could hear it. I don't think that makes me small. I think it makes me honest. Julian called me once, that autumn, on a Sunday evening while I was standing in my kitchen with the water running, and for a few minutes on the phone I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. The version of him I had actually married 8 years earlier peeking through the version his mother had spent a decade patiently constructing around him. He didn't defend her. He didn't try to explain any of it away or ask me to reconsider anything. He only asked how I was doing, genuinely, quietly, in the tired, plain voice of a man who already knew the answer wouldn't include him. I told him I was doing well, which was true, and for a moment neither of us said anything else, just the sound of my faucet running and his breathing on the other end of the line. He never called again after that, and I think we both understood exactly why, and I think, in his own way, he was at peace with it. The following spring, my father called.